Hi everyone. I'm Robert. I work at Granola. The last time I did something like this, we did not have a professional videographer and everything, so it's pretty crazy. But this is Doug Lee. He's going to be our guest for tonight, and he's very excited to have him here. He's been through a long journey, I guess, over like the States and London. Was very early in Facebook, when it was called Facebook, since like 2010, I think.
Yep.
And was there for 9 years. Was also the first employee at OpenAI in London.
Yep.
So some crazy journey, and for the last 8 months, he's been building his own company called Lightfern. I think he'll be able to share a lot more about it than I can. But yeah, I just want to maybe give him a round of applause for coming in and welcoming him. Today's going to be pretty chill. I think we're going to start with like a brief few questions from myself as a moderator, just to open up, and then afterwards we're going to open the floor to everyone else to ask questions. And most of the time we spend for you guys to ask questions to Doug, so we'll go with that. And maybe to start us off, Doug, it would be great to hear like how you went from like, you know, all your journey across like the US and London and like Meta and other startups to OpenAI, and then what made you decide to suddenly start a company like Lightfern in this crazy times in AI?
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me here. I'm super happy to be here. Thank you for Granola, to everybody for obviously setting this up, and for everybody for coming. So how did I start? I got my offer from Facebook back in 2010, largely because I went to a programming competition called the ACM ICPC. Made it all the way to the World Finals. It was a pretty crazy event. They flew us out all the way to Stockholm, and we were competing against everybody in the world just to try to solve these sort of leak code style problems. And one of my friends had heard that I had went to this competition, did reasonably well. He went into Facebook, and then he said, "Hey Doug, like, would you want to get a job at Facebook?" And so I was like, "Yeah, sure. You know, sounds like a very cool company." And this was back in 2010 when Facebook was still much cooler than it is today. But I joined Facebook, and then I worked on a product almost the entire way through. So I started working on a very dead product called Facebook Questions that was led by a person called Blake Ross, who had founded Firefox. And pretty crazy story meeting him at Facebook. So when you want to join a team, you know, you kind of explore a bunch of things over this period called boot camp. I said, "Oh, okay, cool, Facebook, this team sounds pretty cool." I booked a meeting with him. He shows up, he's like, "Hi, my name is Blake, you know, I founded Firefox, blah, blah, blah." And I'm just, okay, cool, like, we're working with some pretty crazy people here. That product didn't go particularly well, but I was kind of hooked on building products all the way from the get-go. I went into privacy, and I built the first version of Activity Log. I revamped the privacy selector with, you know, about 3 or 4 other engineers across most of the sites on Facebook, especially both on desktop and on mobile. And then I went to work on chat and messages. Chat was very broken at the time, so you would send a message in Facebook, you would send a message to somebody else, and there was no sort of state tracking in the UI. And so you would try to send something. If you didn't have internet connection, it would look like it succeeded. And if they had sent you something while your connection had dropped, you obviously wouldn't receive anything, but you would regain internet, and it would still look like they didn't send you anything. And so people were kind of secretly ghosting each other. And so we had arguably developed the most complicated JavaScript application at the time over a rewrite of 4 to 5 months. A lot of state tracking, send receipts, error recovery, error tracking states, and so on, all without a designer. And then I moved on to revamp the messages flow with a designer called Koen Bach, who's now the CEO of Framer. So he had kind of worked on the entire design, and then I just kind of implemented a lot of it on the front end. Moved over to London during that time. My reason was because, you know, my now wife is here, and she's a very cool person, and I want to live with her, and so that was basically it. And then when I was here in London, moving to Facebook, one of the things I didn't like, but really didn't have too much of a choice in, was you were only restricted to work on a couple of things that Facebook's London office actually did support in terms of Teams. And so I went into advertising for about 3 years. I thought I was going to like it, really didn't like it. It just was very different to what I'm excited about. Went back more towards product, running a team called VR Avatars as well as VR Workrooms. So this was over COVID, where it was all about how do we bring your sense of what we called social presence into virtual reality so that you get a sense that you're kind of there with somebody else. I got pretty stressed over the end of that. This was in 2020, late 2021, when I had just had a daughter for not too long ago, and just in general felt like it was very hard to juggle multiple teams at Facebook and lots of reports, along with raising my newborn. And so I had decided to say, oh, hey, let me jump back into artificial intelligence, join a tiny startup called Shift Lab that didn't really go very well, but we had some relationships with OpenAI, specifically the OpenAI fund, which is kind of an investment arm of OpenAI. And they said, when we were closing up shop, they said, hey, we're secretly opening up an office here. Would you guys all like to interview with us? And so I did, and I was the person that kind of snuck in as the first employee in London. So a lot of, honestly, just like a lot of luck, which I'm very thankful for. At OpenAI in London, I was responsible for setting up everything from within the office, but also my primary responsibility is a human data team. And so human data, we collect almost all the data that was required for post-training OpenAI's models. This is everything from the ability to refuse, the ability to simply understand that it's working as an assistant and it's got an identity as ChatGPT as opposed to anything else. Its ability to browse the internet, use Python to basically write and execute Python, use computers, even click on screens and stuff. We had worked with thousands and thousands of trainers, and OpenAI still does that today, to gather data that is really manually labeled so that we can kind of run these sort of post-training processes with these models to create ChatGPT, all of the GPT versions, really. I spent 2 years there. It was a lot of fun. It was very hectic. Went through a lot of things, including what we call the blip, which is when Sam Altman got fired. That was a very exciting time. I also got very sick over that 1.5 weeks. I was not sleeping, not drinking, not eating. And you get sick if you do that, apparently.
Was that correlated with Sam Altman getting like
100%. So what I had during that time was gout, and gout is when your a certain type of acid builds up too much in your body. And one day I woke up feeling this crazy pain in my toe, and I literally could not walk. I could not roll out of bed. I couldn't put a blanket on it. It was that painful. And it builds up because you're not drinking well, you're not eating well, you're not sleeping well, and so on. But yeah, it was 100% correlated with that. I've never gotten it afterwards, so it's clearly 100% correlation right now. Why did I leave OpenAI? So I had worked at OpenAI for over 2 years, and specifically I was feeling a couple of things. One is that kind of the mission of OpenAI has slowly drifted away from what I had originally signed up on, was a capped for-profit, where there was this nonprofit organization. And over the blip, we could actually see the nonprofit had absolute control over the for-profit, right? You could just fire Sam Altman and so on. To a very, very different structure today. And I'm not saying that it's a bad change. Obviously, Anthropic is a public PBC also. OpenAI is hoping to adopt the same structure and everything. But it simply wasn't what I had signed up to do. And I think over time, I still really subscribe to the whole benefiting all of humanity concept. And I believe even today that the OpenAI Charter is one of the best, most aspirational documents ever written. But if I had really poked myself towards the time that I had left, and even now it's look, if there was a competitor that was closer to AGI than OpenAI, would all of the researchers and everybody drop what they're doing to help out this other company or organization? And my answer was very clearly no. And at that point I felt like, oh, okay, cool. This is clearly a different organization than the one I had joined. Let me see how I can benefit humanity in my own way. And so I had left, and then I had started thinking along the lines of, hey, the models today, they're very, very good at coding. If you see what, obviously Anthropic is doing, what OpenAI is doing, everybody's kind of going after the coding space. And I do like to think that Silicon Valley often likes to build things for itself. So even when we're thinking about, hey, okay, how do we benefit all of humanity? Realistically, AI is benefiting everybody for sure, to some extent. there are negative social externalities, which we can talk about obviously afterwards. But when it comes to, is that benefit equal, or if I'm an ML researcher or if I'm in tech or coding, right, I am getting a stupid amount of benefit from artificial intelligence. But if I'm like a marketer or just like some random person who has very, very little relationship with Silicon Valley, and I'm just trying to, I don't know, sell reams and reams of paper, for example, right? And I do a lot of that through professional communication. Like, AI is not really serving me that well. Sure, there's a lot of automated outreach and stuff right now. It doesn't sound very good. It doesn't sound very human. And so I thought, okay, this is a very boring problem that I think a lot of people can actually benefit from. And so we started this journey roughly 8 months ago.
So there's a lot around like framing of, I guess trying to try to bring AI to more people in the world, I guess like a larger population that's beyond like what OpenAI is a bit more focused on, maybe Silicon Valley. Maybe like digging a bit into that, like I guess you're building like a full-on product company now, like an AI product company. How do you think about building and competing in the space? Like you've gone from like working at like one of the frontier AI research labs, which like does a lot of model like development as well as like product work, to now being like really, really focused on like product and end user like engagement. Do you see, like, does Lightfern see, for example, model training to be like a very strong technical moat that you guys focus on and want to like cultivate in like non-coding domains? Or do you think about it more in terms of like, hey, the models are like kind of getting smart enough to the point where like you can, like there's a lot of alpha in just being great at leveraging and applying those models and like delivering a great like product market fit and like end user experience?
So I think both of those statements can be true at the same time, where the existing model capabilities, depending on what you're trying to do, can be extremely good and extremely helpful, especially if you know kind of how to really, really deeply tap into that. And a lot of times that just means like a crazy amount of like prompt engineering plus like evals plus experimentation against yourselves, your vibe check, and your users to kind of develop the correct experience for what you're trying to build. But I think there are also domains that AI arguably isn't very good at, and my take with writing is like I just don't feel like it's a priority for a lot of these large AI model providers, because if I'm one of them, I want to be solving intelligence. I don't like intelligence, period. I want to be the provider of intelligence as a utility for the entire world. And if you hear how OpenAI is talking about it, how Anthropic's talking about it, they often think in these terms these days. So it's like, okay, cool, how do I solve this entire problem? But like, if I'm trying to get help with writing, it's how do I write how do I stay true to myself? I don't want, there's a question of how much human input do I want into this? And I feel like most of the model if not all of the model providers have not fully cracked this. I don't think they're really staring at the problem hard enough. And I think that's completely fine, by the way. Like, I don't think it's a very good strategy for them to just like literally try to solve everything all the time. At the same time, I think OpenAI actually tried to do that arguably in like maybe arguably up to like the beginning of this year. And towards, probably like late last year, very arguably, I would say is not necessarily a good strategy, because you kind of dilute your focus, right? So that's kind of where we can come in with Lightfern, and we can say, hey, cool, what would a model, so what we've done is we've essentially trained an autocomplete model. It's very, very different from any autocomplete experience out there. So far, what we've done to train it is largely synthetic data, right? Because before we've actually launched our products, everything, we didn't have actual emails to be able to train with. Now that we're kind of out there, we're very, very excited to be working on an additional layer of training based on real data that people have been very, very generous to share with us. And one of the things we really care about, obviously, is privacy. We're dealing with email, so our opt-in is very, very explicit when you actually go through the product. But we want to be, when I think about automation versus augmentation, it's not automation that I'm interested in, it's augmentation. Like, people arguably don't want to be automated away. And so it's, okay, cool, how can we kind of improve people's current experience with technology using what we have? Obviously, we're being super wild and kind of out there when it comes to autocomplete, because it's like cool, can we get very, very good at predicting exactly what you're gonna say and an entire sentence of it if we add additional context? And so we're trying to solve many hard problems at the same time. But I do feel like let's really try to push that boundary. You know, we don't know exactly if we're right or if we're wrong, but I absolutely want to find out what that boundary is and whether, you know, we can actually do something about it. By the way, if you want to, you know, try out the product or whatever, so Mishti, our founder's associate, you know, she's very generous and decided to spend her, you know, time today to help out with this. And so if you're interested, go talk to her after this event. You know, she can help you get signed up, and you can also try out a demo.
Yeah, cool. She's great, so please say hi afterwards. Talking a bit about, you guys are training, is this still a language model that you're training?
We are training LLM.
So it's an LLM still?
Yeah.
And like, what I'm hearing is like, okay, the frontier research labs, they're focused on intelligence, which is like, they're optimizing for some like core metric of like being generally smart, but there's a lot of gaps in the edges of like, when you specific use cases and like being focused use cases of, or like what people care about in terms of like actually using it as an end user, that is like maybe like missing, right? There's like a bit of like a cliff there, and you're trying to bridge that gap. What are some of the, as you've been like developing your own models and like building in the space, what are some of like the interesting like failure modes and like I guess bottlenecks you've kind of hit trying to fulfill this like super like very product-oriented AI approach that you think is maybe like gives you some sense of like, hey, oh, this is like, these are the hard problems that AI is maybe not very good at right now, and we're trying to solve, and like these are things that people don't talk about often, but yeah, surprisingly, like these failure modes like crop up a lot, and that prevent us from doing like the real, like delivering on the real good value that you want to deliver.
So maybe I can kind of answer that in a generic sense, and then I can arguably answer that specifically for Lightfern. Yeah. I think Lightfern is trying to solve a very different problem than what the vast majority of people are trying to do with AI. A lot of times when people think about AI, you're thinking about there's some chat interface somewhere, or you're prompting an LLM specifically to do a very clear task. And you know, real-time latency. I think latency matters, but I think the types of things that people are trying to solve, you're willing to wait 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and if it's a very hard thing, even minutes to be able to deliver on that specific task, right? And so the typical failure mode I see there is actually just hallucination. Like, it's pretty wild how I think that's like really still relatively unsolved today. I think depending on which model that you use, I would actually look at OpenAI's models and think there's a good amount of improvement that can be done there. Is the models are very, very good right now at not actively deceiving people, but just like spitting out something, and if you don't dig deeper, it just looks to be true. It will say it with absolute confidence. And one of the reasons I think that's the case is actually, it is reinforcement learning with human feedback, but the issue is with RLHF, if your RLHF data comes from, let's say, production where end users are giving you some signal into training in terms of, hey, like, is this a good response or not? What you end up with is, if that person is not a good determinant of whether something is truthful or not, right? You end up boosting the wrong signal. And it's a very, very, very hard problem to solve. And I think there's this human bias, right? It's like what this is, we're recreating this human bias towards this system that's optimized to get very, very good at some arbitrary score. So we set the score, but we have this human bias of, you know, when you speak to somebody that's confident, right? Even if they might be saying the wrong thing, you're more likely to trust them, especially if you're not an expert or subject matter expert in this field, right? And so I think you can actually see these sort of same biases play out with artificial intelligence. And I think that's one of the risks is, for example, if you're dealing with a legal case, where a lot of times AI will often just like cite cases that do not exist and say, hey, you know, based on this thing that kind of happened, you know, this is what I think you should be doing, or this is like how you can kind of interpret the situation, and that thing didn't actually exist, right? And so, like, obviously you can prompt engineer to say, hey, like double check or triple check, and you can add layers on top of that. You can add additional models that take the first model's output to do a double check and just say, hey, here's some output, go browse the internet and figure out if this thing is true or not or whatever. And those checks will work. They will improve some correctness metric, and you can evaluate on that, and you can create your own eval set. But I feel like it would be pretty hard to build an AI company without actually accounting for this like massive drawback when it comes to like dealing with models today. Like, I don't know if that's been your experience, but
yeah. I think like one of the things that we've struggled with even in Granola building in AI is like, the model doesn't always know, it can't know what it doesn't know, right? And like, it doesn't know what it's missing when it responds to something. And so like, you can give it a lot of context. It can even search the right context, but like if it's missing like, 20% of the context it needs to actually answer the question like fully truthfully, it won't know that, and it'll still just answer like it's like 100%, right? 80% is 100%. And so like that's like one of the very like more subtle cases where like, it actually is relevant, but it's also not the full picture. And so like, you get a very like narrow view of the truth in some ways. Yeah, that's very interesting. Like, so like, tell me about like, how are you guys thinking about in Lightfern? Like specifically, like how you think of tackling this problem, which is like very hard to know, like, hey, the models don't know what they don't know, and they hallucinate. And so they'll say things that sound true, but aren't actually true if you dig a bit deeper.
So, we have an autocomplete model, right? And so the typical failure mode here is it'll just hallucinate a bunch of stuff that's not true. And that hallucination can come in a few forms. It can be, hey, it's gonna spit out a bunch of text that is not the way that I would say it, or it's gonna make up a bunch of facts and it'll readily claim that, right? It will readily claim a bunch of stuff about my calendar, or that we've booked something for tomorrow, or whatever it is, and essentially make up these facts. Without going incredibly deep into our secret sauce and training process, but essentially, even with the current model today, we've developed a method where we can look at a particular generation and figure out, hey, is this something that is truthful or not? And then specifically penalize that specifically over the training process, so that if we think it's not truthful or not correct, we just don't reinforce that type of behavior and actually reinforce the opposite out of the model, so that the model is less likely to hallucinate. And so we are actually on generation 4 of our model, and this generation is still 100% synthetic. But to get here, it was, well, one, it's, you need the model to even know what you're looking at. Where's your cursor, right? And I think cursors obviously solve this with their autocomplete model, but like, you need to be able to represent what the hell is going on in your user space to the model. And so I think the earlier generations were about that, and specifically with generation 4, we had seen sort of this hallucination problem, and we're like, look, this is pretty bad. It's like borderline unusable. Like, how can we apply as much pressure as we can, even right now with the data we have, to strip this out? And so we basically focused the training on only to solve that.
So what I'm hearing is like, it's like in some ways like a very specific way of doing evals that you guys are working on to like give the models, I guess, like a much truer signal of like what truth means and what an accurate answer means given a task, or like some kind of like autocomplete task, right?
That's right.
I guess like, I mean, you spent a lot of time in human data at OpenAI, so it was like a lot of building out data sets from, I guess, humans. Like, is that something that you see as like, I don't know if it's going to secret sauce land, but like, is that like, basically, do you see a world scaling beyond that, or do you think like the ground truth has to come from like human experts?
So the fantastic question. And one of the problems when you're dealing with synthetic data is you don't know how close it actually matches the real distribution of data. So synthetic data, as a quick explainer, it's where you oftentimes get LLMs to generate just data by itself. You can say, hey, give me a fake document where, lawyer A is sending some document to lawyer B and is hoping to like modify a contract or something, right? And it can create these sort of fake cases, and then it can create a fake scenario, it can create a bunch of fake documents, and then you can send it back and forth with each other, and even create this whole chain that on the surface especially if you're not an expert in the field, will look reasonably lifelike. But the question is, these LLMs have a lot of biases, right? They don't represent the full distribution of, let's say, how two lawyers might speak to each other. And so you're probably going to end up with a reasonably relatively narrow cases of scenarios and situations. And then even in those narrow cases, the way that the two LLMs are going to speak to each other, it's going to sound very AI-like. I don't know. You know it when you see it. There's a certain smell about it or feel about it, but you can't put your finger on exactly what it is. And people don't speak that way. And so I think that's definitely one of the risks that you deal with synthetic data is it doesn't match the true distribution, essentially. And so when you train a model on this sort of synthetic distribution, because it doesn't match the real thing, you get a model that's very good with this fake distribution, but not good at the real one. It's very useful for bootstrapping. It's very useful for getting something off the ground when you don't have any data whatsoever. But I think one of the fantastic things about human data is, well, it is the real distribution. You're not even trying to pretend or make some sort of fake distribution that matches the real thing. It's just the real thing. So if you can make sense of that data, and if you can actually train on it, then arguably, you're just going to have an easier time. There are some challenges to working with human data. It's a lot more messier.
More expensive?
It's more expensive, especially if you deliberately go out and you ask people to label it. It's very, very, very expensive. I think that's why a lot of companies in the human data labeling space right now are, very, very successful and have a lot of committed spend with these major AI labs. Yeah.
I want to ask one more question before we open up to the rest of the group. Taking a step back, we've talked a lot about model training, but there's obviously been also a lot of growth around tooling, with a model plus a harness, model plus an environment, and tool calling, things like this. And so there's some co-evolution going on where to get the best output is no longer just a model. It's what do you where do you plug the model into, I guess. And so I guess two questions is, one is how do you see model capabilities developing in the next 6 to 12 months, when in this new world where there's a lot of this co-evolution going on between the model and the tooling around it, and what do you see as some of the gaps of current tooling, right, to better enable the model for end-to-end output?
This is a very exploratory question. So I do think models, they obviously do better with tools. If you just have an LLM that has no access to sort of any tools or MCP servers or however, pick your flavor of tool, right? It's not going to be very useful to some extent, especially if it needs to take actions in the real world. And so, I think a personal assistant, that's kind of, a lot of people are thinking around the lines of, okay, cool, what would that actually look like? What would that feel like? And real personal assistants, executive assistants, people do things, right? And so it's well, you need to get your model to do things, then you need to, give those tools and make them available to the model. Typical failure modes that I see with tools is, one, if you give it too many tools, the model just starts getting very confused. It starts getting confused in terms of what is the right tool to use at a certain time. And before, that number used to be somewhere 5 to 10, even a year ago. I think today, you can easily give a model 30 tools, and it might still do reasonable at those scenarios. But I also know of either a bunch of companies or people kind of circling around this problem of there's some sort of tool directory, and as your model is doing its rollout, either you'll have some sort of dynamically updating system message, or you'll append messages in the conversation history that says, hey, you now have access to this tool, so that the model is not overwhelmed with a massive system prompt of all of the different tools it can potentially access. And the failure mode that you'll see is it'll try to use tools to do the wrong thing. An example is if it needs to update if you tell it to update a document, right, and it has a specific tool to, let's say, update, to look into Google Docs. But it also has access to your file system. And for whatever reason, if you were not authenticated to Google Docs, but your doc is there, right? It will just be like, hey, I can't see that doc, but I'll just readily make up something in like your local file system, and it will just like pretend that that's where it is, or it'll just go super, super deep. You'll just see this chain of like 10, 15 searches on your local file system trying to find this thing that clearly doesn't exist. And I mean, this is kind of a pet example, but when you kind of scale that up to 30 different 40 tools or whatever, models will do crazy things. Like if you give it access to general browsing or the ability to make API calls, like it will try to circumvent that. So like if your Google Doc tool doesn't work, it'll be like, maybe I can make a random direct API call to Google and search the user's file system for like an access token, and then it will just go super deep there. And I think that goes back to how these models are trained. They're trained very, very heavily on reinforcement learning these days. There's some sort of prompt, and the model gets the reward if it achieves the task, but it never gets penalized for not achieving it, right? And so it will do every single thing it can do to achieve this thing. And so when I think about these types of harnesses, that's kind of the pattern that I'm seeing, is a lot of stuff around kind of reducing the complexity of what the model is and isn't capable of doing at every single turn level, at every single message that they would receive from the user. Where do I kind of see that playing out in the next, 6 to 12 months? I don't know if the right, maybe UI is the wrong word, but we have stuff like OpenClaw right now, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's like if you give it unfettered access to every single thing, it'll be able to serve as a personal assistant to you to some extent. It'll also be able to delete your entire file system and all of your emails. It can readily do that. And I think permissioning is something that a lot of people haven't fully solved. I had met Peter, who developed OpenClaw, and went to some of his talks and events, and he specifically said that he was playing in a sandbox. He's like, I'm playing in a sandbox, man. I'm just building a sandcastle, and I thought it's pretty cool, and I'm just trying to build this thing for myself. And then everybody just jumped onto it, and now they want me to make it into Fort Knox. And I think there's probably going to be a lot more work around figuring out specific permissions. How do you make that work in all sorts of different scenarios, whether you're working with company data, or how do I have an agent that's able to access some of the stuff that I can access without accessing stuff that I should not be able to access in, let's say, a corporate environment or something.
So it's a lot around I guess trying to constrain the model in the way that is safe, I guess, safety?
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Gonna open the floor up now for everyone else. So anyone who has a question, please raise your hand, and I'll just pick random people from the crowd. Cool, yes, right up front.
What are your views around the personality of a model? For example, Claude has a different personality to ChatGPT, and I guess it's a really important thing for your product.
So for Lightfern, at least for now, I would say that the personality of our LLMs do not matter as much as making sure that we match the personality of the user and the person who's writing. I think fantastic style following, if we just solve that let's just get to solving that problem very, very well, and then adding additional context and then kind of building on top of it. I think for other model providers though, that is absolutely key, is, hey, what flavor of, how do you want to interact with this thing, right? If it's a mass consumer tool versus a work tool, maybe you want to adopt a different personality. People obviously have very, very long either system prompts or memories together with, especially for a product like ChatGPT that people have been using for 2-3 years now. And when OpenAI decided to say, hey, we're shutting down 4.0, there was this corner of the internet that just were really dissatisfied, because they said this is their buddy, their friend, and they had developed some sort of relationship with it, and all of a sudden, like very clearly, like all the GPT-5 series, they talk and speak in a different way, and that actually varies by model iteration. So, like GPT 4.0, there's actually multiple improvements. So what you see as 4.0 is actually like 5-6 different models underneath that have gotten updates. But I think both. I would not be surprised if Anthropic internally had a very clear guide on how exactly the model should feel like when they're using it, and obviously I think with ChatGPT also, like there is this, essentially like as a company, you want to define what the default style is, right? You want to give people generally a good user experience right from the get-go, and it's your own signature on the product that you put out there. I think it really changes people's initial, I guess, impression of how it is like working with AI.
Cool. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi. First, sorry for almost choking myself.
No worries.
Awesome. Oh, yeah. So you mentioned that the training of LLM is using reinforcement models trainings, and the models are not. There's no punishment given when they send the wrong result, or giving when we have a positive response when we get the reward. And why is that? And is there,
It depends on kind of the domain that you're trying to, the problem that you're trying to solve. My understanding of the vast majority of approaches taken today with RLVR, so reinforcement learning with verifiable rewards, is let's say you pose like a very, very hard math problem to a model, right? And then the model is able to try many, many times to get to the answer. And if you penalize wrong answers super early on, then it's very hard for it to do exploration. To balance out what is exploration with just like loss minimization, if that makes sense. Because if you add some sort of penalty term, all of a sudden, like the easiest thing for a model to do, instead of getting problem wrong arguably, is just do nothing, right? And so oftentimes you just want a model to be able to explore and take many, many attempts at trying to solve your problem. And then as soon as it gets some attempts correct, you're just like, okay, cool, there's some sort of useful learning signal there, right? But for all of the other attempts that it failed at, especially if it's a very hard problem, you don't necessarily penalize it much or at all. With RLVR, you can read the papers for RLVR, like really there's no penalty. And so balancing out exploration versus just like doing the right thing is really, really hard. You can, like, let's say you figure out some way of training. You have a training idea that says, look, instead of confidently saying something that might potentially be false, right? You will say, okay, cool. What if the model just says, I don't know? What if you would prefer I don't know answers versus very clearly wrong answers, right? For a model that's faced with this training scenario, overtraining, let's say that it only gets 1% or 2% of 100 tries right? And so for the 98% of cases, it's just going to say, I don't know. And very early on, when you're training and the model is not very, very good, it's just going to default to I don't know all the time, and it'll just stop there. It just won't improve. It'll just give up on exploration.
Why do I, follow-up question on that is, there's one thing of giving an answer that sounds confident, another thing of the confidence score behind that answer. So why can't I give a confidence score of an answer while still sounding confident every time? Doesn't that solve the problem of I don't know?
Calibrating is very, very hard in the middle of your process when, and actually I think for the vast majority of training signal, really, one, that number changes over time as you're training, right? So initially your model might be correct 1% of the time. Towards the end of training, it might be like 10% of the time. And so if you're calibrating as you're training, then that number is going to be constantly changing, and it'll constantly be wrong all the way up till the end, and then maybe you can kind of do something there. And so in and of itself, just like very, very accurate calibration is already very hard for a naive policy by itself to figure out. So not only is it just like a very hard problem on a theoretical level, there are many approaches for sure to calibration. I'm not an expert at it. In fact, I'm 100% novice at it, just like everybody else. But outside of calibration, I think the real thing is, as humans and a lot of the reinforcement learning with human feedback signal that we give to these models, we're not a good determinant of it ourselves in terms of whether something is correct or not. And so if you just take like with RLHF, right, what humans will be shown is you're going to be shown a bunch of different answers or whatever, and you might pick which one is the best, which one is the worst, and various grades in between. If you are not a subject matter expert, sometimes these things, they're just going to sneak in. And you're just going to readily pick one that you're just like, hey, this sounds fantastic, right? And then when you actually look at the details, it's just wrong at this subtle level. So I think it has more to do with how we're training these models as opposed to, so I think it's two things. It's one, calibration in and of itself is reasonably hard, and you need a very, very dedicated effort in kind of your really training pipeline to think about where do we add the calibration, how do you surface that to a user, if anything. And also, it's a lot of times when a model gets something wrong, it's not also 100% wrong. It'll mix truths and half-truths and complete falsehoods, right? So it's like, how do you label that? How do you bring that up to the user? And then even if you did that, it's, okay, cool. As humans, we're not good determinants to some extent of what is accurate or not if you're not an expert. So two very hard things to solve.
Cool. Well, a lot of couple. Let's go with Michael right in the front, and then.
So you see LLMs always improving and have like Anthropic, so like if you ask it to make an email, it have like different tones now, right? You're probably aware you don't want it to sound too much like AI. I think like in the future, you see like Claude will probably, try to make emails sound like even more like a human and even more like yourself. How do you guys, are you guys thinking about that, and how you guys will differentiate from Claude, or how they can't really, do what you guys are doing?
I think the quick answer to this is like when I'm using a device that I literally use for over 8-10 hours a day, every single day, and all of my information is on that device, I don't want to be prompting anything. I don't want to be prompting anything for it to generate the right output. It should just know me as a person. And I think that's very, I just fundamentally don't think that, talking together with a chatbot is necessarily the best way to do that, even if it gives me 8 different styles, right? It's like, how many different permutations can you have of just greetings and sign-offs? It's like best regards, sincerely, whatever, and then I can sign my name as Douglas Lee or Douglas or Doug or Dash Doug or whatever, and then you get into this kind of combinatorial explosion of all of the little bits. And what we've learned with Lightfern is people are very, very particular about this. It's like their personal signature, your signature in terms of your piece of work, right? And I just don't want to be prompting, period, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Next question. We're at the back.
Hi, thanks. In an environment where there's so much competition for talent, how do you ensure that you're able to sort of hire and retain the best talent? How do you ensure that OpenAI doesn't come and take your team?
One, I cannot ensure that at all. If OpenAI looks at, all of the Lightfern team members and it's just like, hey, these people are amazing, we should just poach all of them, and there's absolutely nothing that I can do aside from saying, hey, we're working on a very different problem and we believe in our mission. It's going to take us some time to get there, but we really want to give it our best shot. And if you're interested in what we're building, then come join us, come talk to us. It's a problem we really care about. That's an intrinsic motivator, right? And I think even when I was doing recruiting at Facebook, one of the things that we were taught to very quickly screen is what is your sense of where does your sense of motivation come from? Is it internal, is it intrinsic, or is it extrinsic? Those were the exact words that were used. And so extrinsic, these are things like, what is your salary, what is your title, how many reports do you get, external sources of praise, whatever, all of those things are external. And then intrinsic is like something that fundamentally you personally really want to achieve, and it's like nobody can take away that intrinsic drive, right? And so we selected very heavily on, I think, that sort of intrinsic motivator. It's not like extrinsic motivations are bad, but I think especially as like an early pre-seed stage startup, like I am not Mira Murati, right? I am ex-OpenAI for sure, but I also think that, we want to make a very targeted, reasonably sized bet in this specific domain to understand, hey, is there a better solution to doing this, right? But if OpenAI came to any of the Lightfern employees today and said, hey, like, we're going to give you, $10 million, comp packages, I'm like, well, I clearly cannot do that. But in terms of competition for talent, and I think your question is simply trying to get very deep into where can you find really, really good people today and retain them, if that's your question. London is crazy, dude. Like, the talent here is just absolutely incredible. And I think the things that I screen for very early on in the interviewing process is, one, are they like super motivated to do something, and they will stop at nothing to do it. And I think you very, very quickly get a sense of this when you're chatting with people in the interview process. Is like, is this person interesting and do they stand for something, right? And then afterwards it's, okay, cool, then do they have a proven ability historically, right? And people can talk a lot about what they can do in the future, but you want previous examples of this is, do they have examples historically where they were faced up with various challenges over time, and had to really break out of, their rules or the structures that were in place to jump across three different functions to say, okay, cool, like, I'm just going to solve this. This is my thing. I'm just going to solve this, right? And I think hard skills actually matter less than that kind of soft skill, where it's just like, some people use the word agency for this, like I do agree with that. And I think actually what you get from London and I think the European tech ecosystem is there are people with just this crazy sense of agency if you look hard enough. It's very different, I would say, from arguably the mean that's in the US. I would say in general people, very strictly speaking, I might sound a little bit biased here, but I would say in general Americans score higher on confidence compared with, I would say, like the typical London person. It's like a cultural trait, right? But I think if you're able to look past that and find the people that are willing to do things, I think you get somebody who not only is extremely good at getting things done, but also kind of has this sensitivity to working incredibly well as a team and being very open to different viewpoints in terms of how you can get that done to like a really high level of quality.
Thanks. Other questions? We'll take one from there.
I'm curious how you've decided to frame the value to like users autocomplete, because I kind of think about that, like the thing I think about is like, oh, is that a feature? Is that an application? And how do you think about kind of niche versus broad and kind of vertical specialization? Like, what's the right kind of way to tackle the framing of value of this application layer?
Great question. The short answer is we have not nailed it yet. It's like it's a very hard thing to describe to people, I think, when people use it. And I think especially where Lightfern is resonating the most with people is specifically sales and marketing right now, because these people, nailing the tone of voice is very important. Coming across as human is very important. But people want writing assistants, right? It's like, going back to what I said earlier, it's just like, there's so much of ChatGPT usage is specifically, hey, can you help me write? To some degree or extent. And so it's like, how can we give people that assistance and benefit while still being very, very true to exactly what that person wants to, how they want to come across as like a human, not as an AI. There's multiple layers to your question, and you also asked specifically about, what is the vertical versus the horizontal, right? Short term, we have, gone into email, and I think it's a fantastic place to start because it's where people do a lot of professional communication. But the longer term answer to this is we don't want to only be in email. We want to think about all the places where communication happens across different companies. And so this might be over LinkedIn, for example, like my LinkedIn is reasonably out of control. There's a lot of business and communication that happens over WhatsApp, especially in Europe. But a lot of that communication is reasonably routine, right? I want to sound like a human. I've pitched my sales guide or my pricing guide, 50 times already. I shouldn't have to type that over and over again. But I also want to tailor it specifically to this person. And I want to tailor it to, what has happened before, what we talked about before, or whatever. It's a hard concept to I think bring across to people because there's no product that does this today, right? It's like the closest thing you get is ChatGPT, is ChatGPT, but you're copying and pasting everything into it. And so I think we're seeing the need, but it's a new category of something that I don't think is really exactly there yet.
Take a few more.
My question is around what are the leadership lessons that you applied and that you took from your time at Meta that you're kind of integrating into Lightfern today? And then bonus question would be, do you ever see a world where you would one day return to OpenAI?
I'll do the leadership one first. So, there's a lot of lessons. So I think the first one is, I think you win as a team, you lose as a team, you slay as a team. And I think one of the fantastic things about building products or companies or just anything useful to the world is if you have a group of really talented people and all of them have somewhat different skill sets, but they're very, very good in that one specific skill set, and you get everybody to work together and really respect each other and their unique talents, to the point where it's just like, look, if I hand off something to anybody in our team, for example, and say, hey, can you take this? I'm going to be working on this part. Can you work on this other part? And they say yes. I have 100% faith and confidence that that's just going to get delivered to completion to this very high level of quality. And when you have everybody working together in that kind of environment where it's not only me, obviously, as a leader, but for anybody else in the team to be able to bring that type of information to other people, then it's just magical. It's just so much fun to be in that kind of environment. And this happened when I was working at Facebook, specifically with the VR avatars team. It was a very, very small team of unbelievably senior people, but you could talk to them all the way down to like specific facial muscle movements in the face and talking about like what is uncanny and what isn't uncanny and how do you swim out of the uncanny valley and how do you take, for example, people's voice and microphone recordings to convert it into specific muscle movements in the face that's not generic mouth flapping. It's like there's this crazy level of quality that you can get to if you build kind of the right team. And so, and then just like give people a crazy amount of trust and just kind of protect that at all costs. I think that's like a fantastic thing to do. Agency, which I talked about earlier, is super, super important. When I think about hiring, diversity is almost a bad word right now, but I do hire for diversity, not so much in the DEI sense, but very specifically in terms of do you bring a specific set of skills or something from your experience that is something that other people in the team do not have today. And that fundamentally is going to make our entire team better. You can be weak at a lot of things, but you need to very clearly spike at this one thing that everybody else on the current team, especially for like a very small startup like us, is very, very bad at. Because then you can bring this sort of additional viewpoint, this new way of solving problems that you wouldn't have otherwise in, you know, the rest of your team. And it goes to this crazy degree where if you are dealing with, you know, sort of this new problem, is well, how do you find product market fit, or how do you market something to a set of users? Having the right person on your team will mean you can actually see opportunities that simply aren't there. You wouldn't be able to even take that path if that person wasn't on your team, if that makes sense. Would I return to OpenAI in the future? Like, I'm not closing off that opportunity, but like short term, definitely not. You know, I'm trying to build Lightfern. I want to see where this goes.
Cool. Take maybe 2 more questions, and then we'll have like some time for people to just chill and hang out. So, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, very insightful. You clearly did like lots of evals and currently doing lots of evals, and then the question I have is, what would be like the recent trends on those, and what are the things that work really well for, I guess, recent developments in sharing?
Yeah. I think one mistake that I see people make is like not actually looking into the evals that you're running and the specific cases. I mean, I worked on the data for a long time, and so I will like manually look through like hundreds and hundreds of cases to see if they're correct or not. Because if your eval ground truth is not correct, then you're gonna get garbage out of the eval, right? And so for us, we had a synthetic, you know, data generation pipeline. We also generated a bunch of evals, but I manually looked through every single case to be like, look, is this measuring the right thing? And you don't need a lot of cases, you know, depending on the amount of signal that you want, right? Like 50 cases, 100 cases is already sufficient, especially if you want this thing to be like 100% all the time. If you're trying to eval like a small percentage point, like a 51, 52% win rate over something else, then you need a massive data set for your eval. But if you want it to be correct all the time, then you just need a very small eval set. Yeah, I don't know. Have evals. A lot of people don't have evals. A lot of people go by gut. You can't build anything long lasting with gut. You know, you're gonna improve in the dimension that you're looking at, and then you're going to regress in all the other dimensions, right? So, yeah.
Cool. And last question, right at the back.
Is there anything about any belief that you hold about AI or how to run an AI company that maybe the rest of the industry would disagree with you?
I don't know, dude. That's such a hard question. I think most of the industry, I think the vast majority of the industry actually like just doesn't do training of AI models at all. And I do think that if you know exactly what you're doing, which I've learned is like a reasonably hard skill to get, or you'd have to pay a lot for it. But I do think that it does make your model and your capabilities stand out compared with everybody else. But to get there, you must have tried everything. Like you want to go for the simplest solution all the time. It's easy to say that. It's actually quite hard in practice. I think especially when I think people generally get married or tied to their ideas, and they're like, hey, you know, what if we did this thing and we can add this extra model and another model to correct that, and then all of a sudden you've got 5 different models all running at the same time, and it becomes this very complicated thing. There's a time where I think that's necessary and needed, especially if you have a complex product with lots and lots of users, and you can very clearly evaluate that, as you said, to make sure that it's delivering the right output in all of those cases. But before making things more complicated, I would say like stick to the easiest thing first, keep improving that. You're gonna probably hit this wall of performance, and then you can kind of figure out, hey, do I want to improve that further with additional training? And is that going to be my mode? Like, I think a lot of people are not asking that final question. But I'm very biased, obviously, because I train models.
Cool. Thanks so much, Doug, for being here and sharing a lot of your experience. We're done with the questions, but please stick around. I think Michelle from Lightfern is there, so you can say hi to her. Doug, I don't know if you have time to just hang around for a bit and then just chat, so he'll be around if you want to chat more. I think we're closing at 8:30, so it's you got 45 minutes to just chill, eat more food, drink a bit more, and chat. So thank you all for coming, and thanks, Doug, as well. So.